Assalamu alaikum, everybody. A very warm welcome, everyone, to this week's ISB Campus eCircle event. This week's event is the second part of a two-part series on Islam and international relations, and it is the human rights debate this week with Mubashir Khan. So without further ado, I will be introducing our speaker today. Mubashir Khan has been a member of the Islamic Society of Britain since its inception, and before that, the Young Muslims UK. He was a member of the ISB Tarbiyah Committee and a leading member of the Islam Awareness Week team for many years. He is now one of the mentors of ISB Campus, and he joins us today from his home in Woking, Surrey. So, please do take it away.
Thank you very much, Dina, for that. Much appreciated. Let me just share my screen. Is that looking okay?
Yes, it's great.
Okay. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salam ala rasulih al-kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Well, welcome to part two of this mini series with me looking at some juicy topics in the ISB Campus Classical to Contemporary syllabus, which we have started a few years ago. It's the brainchild of Dr. Rizwan Syed. And it is something which we're looking at analysing the vision, priorities, attitudes, culture, language, and also potentially fiqh. So it fulfills our purposes and the needs of our situation. And it's a long syllabus, so just to make things a little bit more exciting, give us a taste of what may lie ahead. I've been charged with exploring some of these interesting topics, which I'm sure we'll cover again in depth in future with somebody half decent. Anyway, so this is just an overview or introduction to the issues at hand. Last time we did the topic on just war, and there are some differences with just war and some overlaps. So I'm going to use this opportunity to maybe reflect on what I said in the previous circle, e-circle as well, and expand. So the previous topic was about the idea of jihad as perpetual warfare, and this one is about human rights. So the previous one is actually, in a way, many ways easier to deal with and more straightforward, because there's a consensus amongst Muslim scholars that warfare in the modern world can only be called for in cases of self-defense. If you like, it's a sort of modern day ijma consensus, and all Muslim countries have signed up to international protocols as such. So just as a reminder, where it says yus ad bellum, this means the justifications for going to war. Yus in bello, we didn't talk about that at all, because this is actually already in accordance with pretty much the traditional Muslim law. For example, the prohibition on targeting civilians, non-combatants, elderly women, children, people, religion, animals, environment. And there's also an overlap in this with human rights. But on human rights, there isn't really a consensus around the world, except in broad terms. And there have been a range of responses from Muslim scholars, and certainly no consensus on the details of the laws. And even if you were to argue, well, it doesn't matter because everybody signed up to these international agreements, it's not quite as straightforward, because not everybody has actually signed all the covenants and conventions. The agreements are still up for debate in their detailed application. And the problem, well, one of the issues with the human rights organization, maybe the human rights industry, as some people call it, is that a country can still be pursued in some way, even if they haven't signed anything. So my next slide is just to show you what I'll be talking about in these in the next few minutes. 4 parts to this. Briefly, in the first part, I'll introduce the concept of human rights. In part 2, I'll try to give an overview of some of the Muslim responses and try to explain why there is no consensus around it. In part 3, I'm planning to examine just one of the issues in contention, namely the issue of apostasy and freedom of religion. And in part 4, I'll try and recap and summarize and maybe synthesize with some concluding views. So those of you who did A-level essay subjects will recognize the classic thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure of this presentation. So let me get on to it. I apologize. I might have to rush through it a little bit because I have too many slides once again. I might have to skip over a couple, but inshallah, we'll benefit in some way. Why do we need to even know about these topics? We're not in positions of government. We're not dealing with issues of war, nor are we in Muslim majority countries who are grappling with these issues, most acutely. But we are part of the world, and we're Muslims. We're at university. We're expected to have some level of, religious literacy, if you like. So it's almost incumbent upon us to know the debate so that we can be better informed when we come across it. So human rights is nearly always in the news. I only picked these news items because they appeared in the last weeks, and each of them reflects some different aspect of human rights. The first one was about a British law professor who was under fire over his Islamophobic statements, and the complaint was that it related to a human rights module that he was teaching. The second one is about the United States using the issue of human rights in its foreign policy. The next one is about China and the human rights abuses carrying out in that country. Another one is about the issue of human rights regarding what happened in the US state of Texas. And each story represents a different aspect of human rights. The first one may be some ignorance and prejudice. The second one, the sort of politicization of it. The third one, the genuine concern for abuse of human rights around the world, wherever it occurs. And maybe the fourth one represents the dynamic and evolving nature of human rights. Because it is a complicated subject. It's complicated partly because of the fact that there are, interrelated factors. We don't say it's so complex that we can't do anything or say anything meaningful, and I don't want to oversimplify, but with each of these, with history, there's a troubled history of human rights, in the sense of there's a troubled history regarding ex-colonial countries feeling like there is a kind of cultural imperialism. There's also a contested history of the origin of human rights law. There's a sort of politicization of human rights, accusations of opportunism and hypocrisy. Socioeconomic factors play a major part because it's the socioeconomic transformation of the world which has come through modernization in the last couple of 100 years. It's totally transformed life, urbanization, industrialization. It's been breaking up traditional communities, transforming patterns of work. It brings new wealth and also poverty and overcrowding, unemployment, new attitudes to the relationship between sexes. All of these things have an impact on people's understanding of human rights as well. Culture has been transformed by that. What is the relationship between human rights and culture? Philosophically, can we assume that human rights are universal? And also religiously, because that's another major factor, certainly in the debate within Islam on human rights, because religion is still very important in Muslim societies, unlike in many Western societies. And partly because the West has a different history, which is very antagonistic to religion. And in many ways, their process of secularization has moved religion away from the public sphere and actually, if you like, privatized it. So this is a really interesting way of actually looking at a lot of subjects within religious studies. This comes from the Harvard Religious Literacy program from Diane Moore. It's a way of studying religion, and there's some principles. I've only given the sort of the top three here, general principles for anyone studying any religion, and I think they're useful for us to know, because I think this applies to Islam as well. Number one, that religions are internally diverse. Number two, that they are not monolithic in nature. They are characterized by a great deal of internal diversity. Number two, that religions are not ahistorical or static, but they evolve and change over time. And number three, that religion is intimately and inexorably tied to culture, context, and all aspects of society. So I'll come back to this slide at the end. This applies to Islam, I think, but maybe there are some limits to this. So the point of this is we're aiming for literacy, not scholarship. Well, yet. So inshallah, maybe some of you listening to this will become scholars in this field and will able to illuminate all of us. So I move on to the first topic. Really, what are human rights? Well, very simply, human rights are the rights of the human, rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. This is directly from the United Nations website. Human rights include the right to life, liberty, freedom from slavery, torture, freedom of opinion expression, the right to work, education. So they often are split up into what's called generations of rights, first, second, and third, and maybe even a fourth generation of rights. The first generation rights, sometimes called blue rights, deal essentially with liberty and participation in sort of politics. The second type of rights are sometimes called red rights. They're what's called I suppose they're sometimes called positive rights as opposed to negative rights, which are the blue ones. Employment, food, education, healthcare. There's a difference between them because of the way that human rights was first conceived. There was an emphasis from some states, like the Western states, on the blue rights, the first generation rights, but some of the communist bloc was more focused on the red rights. So I can't remember who it was in America who called the red rights sort of utopian goals, not rights. Or he actually used the phrase, it was a letter to Santa Claus. Maybe it was a sheep. And the third generation rights are the sort of collective rights. They're often called the green rights, rights to independence and self-determination, or peace and development. A lot of this was missing in 1948 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written, because colonialism still existed, and some of the countries involved in writing that did not really think of that at the time. And maybe there's a fourth generation to do with the emerging digital world. I don't know. So international human rights law has come from from the sort of UN Charter, the ideas of human rights that were floating around in society. And the United Nations created this comprehensive body of human rights laws. It actually codified it through a process, which I'll talk about in a minute, in 1948, resulted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That itself was a non-binding instrument. There was no mechanism to enforce it. So the UN Commission drafted 2 additional covenants, which were eventually, came into fruition in 1966, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So you could see how the 2 rights were split, but both of them, the 2 generations of rights were split, but both appeared at the same time. As well as that, you see, it's not just, these are not just on paper. United Nations has also set up, has also established conventions, a Human Rights Council, which reports to the General Assembly. It reviews the human rights records of all 192 United Nations member states every 4 years. There's a High Commissioner for Human Rights. So it's a whole system. And in the UN, human rights is an integral part of the United Nations system. And this is just an idea, really, of the various other conventions that exist to do with elimination against forms of discrimination against women, convention against torture, on the rights of the child, on persons of disabilities. So there's a huge system involved. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is, as some people see it, is that there is a poor human rights record in some Muslim countries, and also other countries as well. There are differences in state laws in Muslim countries. And some of these Muslim states have discrepancies, and they've attributed them to so-called Sharia law. So this is another example, like Lime, where we talked about the misunderstandings about jihad, of another example of the clash of civilizations, maybe some sort of evidence for it. And maybe as an example of some of the opinions that are out there is this ruling from the European Court of Human Rights, which is the local European, if you like, body, because human rights is actually regionalized in a way. the European Court of Human Rights, probably the leading regional human rights body, gave a ruling regarding the fact that the Turkish Welfare Party in 1998 was banned by the Turkish Constitutional Court. The issue went to the European Court of Human Rights in 2003 because the ban was against articles on freedom of expression and opinion. But the European Court upheld the Turkish ban, and because it allows some countries to override certain articles on freedom of religion and freedom of expression because there's some overriding concern for public order. But the reason was quite staggering. For me, anyway, I think this display at the highest levels of European bureaucracy of what I would call religious illiteracy. They were banned, and there you could see here that the court felt that they know what Sharia is, and they know for a fact that it would be against human rights and against democracy. In fact, you can see in the quote there, they said it's difficult to declare one's respect for democracy and human rights while at the same time supporting a regime based on Sharia. In actual fact, in the court documents, they say the same thing about the issue of jihad. They have a sort of fixed, if you like, extremist understanding of it. So that's kind of what we're up against. And this next slide is actually the slide, that first story I mentioned earlier about that professor in Bristol. This is actually his own slide that I found in a newspaper article. And it's not completely incorrect. And so these are some of the areas where there is some tension between laws in some Muslim countries and differences in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But perhaps the way it's been expressed is kind of slightly one-sided. Anyway, inshallah, I'll move on to the next part of this, which is the responses to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the first thing I'll look at is the history of it, because in a way, the history and origins of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights affects how Muslims have come to view it, understand it, and relate to it, and also respond to it. I will look at two, if you like, two approaches to it, and maybe I'll have to pick one at the end in part 4. So the idea of human rights comes from a mix of Buddhist ideas, natural law, Roman law, and you'll often see a list like this, nearly all of them a list like this of where did human rights come from, and people often say from the Magna Carta is the beginning of the sort of idea of rights, and moving on towards John Locke and the Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions. This is a very contested history. It's a very Western perspective, but for some people, human rights is if you like, a Western invention, but their particular understanding of human rights has emerged from a unique situation in Western Europe, which hadn't happened anywhere else in the world. And you can see that the Enlightenment has had a major influence in this area, and similarly, we mentioned it, in the previous talk, as the world moved towards I mentioned glimpses of peace, and I mentioned Hugo Grotius in the last talk, who wrote this book, The Rights of War and Peace. But he proceeded as if the reason why his works, I didn't mention this last time, but his works were banned by the Pope at the time, was because he began by proceeding as if God did not exist. And part of the issue with the Enlightenment and what happened in Europe, the history of war and challenge of the authority and existing hierarchies of power, like the monarchy and the church, is that the role of religion declined in society. I mean, there is a history of human rights that is from non-Christian religions, and other societies will have their own, if you like, parallel sort of history. But human rights law itself is slightly different, and it's gone, if you like, gone beyond the ideas from where it actually started. And when you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most significant factors shaping the discourse at the time was the horrors of World War II, and some have suggested that the specific crimes of Nazism were at the forefront of people's minds when they were drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the death counts, the genocide, and the Holocaust. When it was actually when the commission was set up, and it took 2 years for the commission to write the actual document of human rights. There are only 30 articles in it, and it's worth having a look actually at it and worth reading it. And some people treat it as a almost sacred document. I think there were only 56 members of the United Nations at the time, and now there are 192. And you can see also there that those 3 documents together, the Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR and the ICESCR, represent 3 of them together represent what's called the International Bill of Rights. So let me move on to the Muslim responses to the Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, there are so many different types of responses, and people have tried to categorize them in 3, 4, and 5. The reality is it's a spectrum of views. I don't think anybody rejects them completely, because there's a lot of overlap with Muslim tradition. But I'm going to use two categories in this description, and this that comes from Professor Mashoud Badarin, where he talks about harmonistic views and adversarial views. But the first type of response, if you like, is not really a spot response, but the first point is that Muslim states actually did participate in the original drafting of the Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent convention and also covenants. But this is actually both a positive maybe and a negative argument, because those advocating a harmony, they're at pains to describe the inclusive process by which the drafting took place. Everybody was surveyed, and it took 2 years to gather opinions. The reality is that well, I wasn't there. The many countries did not take part and were not independent. And for example, of the 57 members of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, it was originally called, were only 7 were independent at the time. Eventually, any country that did become a member of the UN adopted all the treaties and actual conventions. But now there are 193. Almost one of the first responses, not first responses, but they said that Muslims didn't really start to engage in this debate until after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Maybe we know anyway in the 1970s the human rights movement was growing, as distinct from the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, Malcolm X was calling for human rights, and Dr. King was calling for civil rights. But one of the most famous contributions was by Maududi in 1976. And Maududi was a genius in many ways, and very influential, far beyond the Indian subcontinent. And his approach begins in quite a sort of defiant manner. And I think it's quite interesting sort of introduction to his book. The people in the West have the habit of attributing every good thing to themselves, trying to prove that it is because of them that the world got this blessing. Otherwise, the world was steeped in ignorance and completely unaware of all these benefits. Very, very defiant sort of big introduction. So some of the people have called it a sort of an assimilationist approach and appropriation. But it glosses over some of the specific questions and details. I think it's more of an education book for Muslims themselves. And I kind of see the other charters that were developed, the alternative Islamic human rights schemes, in a similar way. I didn't mention the Arab Charter. the process for that started before 1979, but then it didn't really continue because the OIC was doing something. But an Egyptian delegate quite candidly described it as he said it was a regional shield against international pressures on Arab states. But the Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by the Islamic Council of Europe in 1981, is interesting. It's actually peppered with references. It's not peppered at the end of it. There's references to the Quran and Hadith, and I mentioned it at the end in my references, but you can find it today on a website called salam.co.uk. And the other one, the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, is slightly more formal because it was actually adopted by the OIC in 1990. So it has some kind of political authority. But they have problems in the sense that they're a little bit vague as far as a legal document goes. And also because they often have the phrase, the declarations are limited by law, or actually has in Article 24, all the rights and freedoms related in this declaration are subject to the Islamic Shariah, which is kind of a vague thing to say because, as we know from last time, a Sharia can be interpreted in lots of different ways, not lots, but in different ways. So the effect of this is that the interpretation of Sharia is left to the states and the governments to decide, which actually makes things worse because some of the point of human rights is to limit the power of governments. And what's actually happening here is that you're giving the government the power to decide themselves what their limits should actually be, which is actually not historically what happened in Islam. In Islam, our fiqh was developed by private scholars who were separate from the state, and in a way part of the fiqh was developed to limit the state. But I still think these documents are useful. They serve to sort of, they serve to normalize the discussion about human rights, and perhaps it's an indication that Muslims are going to engage with it seriously. But I also think that many uneducated or maybe poor people in the world don't even know their basic rights, which are from the Sharia: the right to privacy, right to property, right to education, right to healthcare, right to a fair trial, innocent until proven guilty, freedom from torture. These are really core, really important rights. So before I talk about the Muslim response, it's worth just dwelling just for a few minutes on this, because the starting point for a discussion on human rights in Islam is actually the essential inherent dignity of all human beings, as mentioned in the Quran, where it says, "Laqad karamna bani Adam." We have bestowed dignity on the children of Adam, in a couple of places in the Quran. And this dignity of the primordial human being, Adam being the primordial human being, stems from these factors. I would say from the divine breath within us. Allah says in the Quran, "Thumma sawahu wa nafakha fihi min ruhihi." So he breathed something of his spirit into him. And the dignity stems from the divine spirit, intellect, maybe I also mentioned fitra, free will, ability of speech and language. Allah says, Surah Ar-Rahman, "Allama al-Quran, khal insan, allamahu al-bayan." He taught them speech. Okay, so dignity is not earned, and it is a proven right of every human being, regardless of his race or religion. And it's established at the moment of birth. And this is why this incident, almost this incidental event in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, was a major teaching moment for the companions of the Prophet radiallahu anhum. A funeral procession passed in front of them, and the Prophet stood up. There's a tribal society of Arabia. So one of the companions mentioned that the deceased person was a Jew, and the Prophet said, he said, "Is he not a human soul?" The Prophet did not consider that the religious following of the deceased person to have any bearing on his inherent dignity. So This shared spiritual quality is the basis that we have in Islam for forbidding anything that would belittle, debase, demean the human being. It provides the basis of modern doctrines of human rights. It's not enough, because we now need to go into more detail, but it is the basis in Islam. And I thought it was just worth spending a minute or so on that. Also, there's a couple of others. These are some of the Ya Ayyuhan Nas ayahs. These are like declarations to all of humankind in the Quran. And the dignity that applies to equally to all men and women. It applies equally to all, regardless of what nation or tribe. The key phrase in that first ayah is he created you from a single soul, min nafsin wahidatin. Okay. And one of the I think overlooked parts of the second famous ayah from Surah Al-Hujurat is people, we created you from a single pair of male and female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other. This is, we are called upon to get to know one another. Okay, this is not just a call for toleration, but actually for respect. And then these are from the farewell Hajj, the khutbah at the farewell Hajj, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "O people, your Creator is one. You are all one from the same ancestor. All of you are from Adam, and Adam was created from dust." We know about some of these core values, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. But I just mentioned also freedom of religion. Another core value is freedom of religion, because without this essential freedom, people would not be able to choose God. Nobody would ever have been able to stop the wrong that they were doing and actually follow the prophets. So it is another one of these core values. And so, even though the actual language maybe of the term human rights is not in the traditional Islamic vocabulary, Muslim scholars, there's no dispute over issues of agree that there's no dispute over issues of semantics. So, if you like, huquq al-insan is maybe the closest understanding that we have to this, and there are plenty of if you like. Ideas and also developments within Islam, and each of these I've listed actually is either a lecture or a book or a course in its own right. So I won't dwell on it too much. Huquq Allah and huquq al-insan shows you that within Islam there was a system of, if you like, mutual obligations. And I just wanted to highlight the one I mentioned earlier about the rights of the ruled upon the ruler. These are all part of the rights that we know that are in the texts in the Quran and in the Sunnah. And there's something called Huquq Allah. Mu'adh bin Jabal reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Oh Mu'adh, do you know what is the right of Allah upon his servants?" He said, "Allah and his messenger know best." He said, "It is to worship him alone, to associate none in worship with him. And do you know what is their right upon him?" And he said, "Allah and his messenger know best." He said, "Not to punish them if they do so." The Maqasid Shariah is a significant development in Islamic legal theory from about the 11th of the Common Era century onwards, an approach to the legal purpose of the law. And this is 6 centuries before, I think, John Locke's articulation of a similar approach to law in England. And this approach avoids a kind of legalistic, hair-splitting approach to law and attempts to holistically recapture the sort of spirit of the Sharia. And so Imam Ghazali mentioned, or he made famous the preservation of the five values: preservation of faith, life, mind, wealth, and also family. But other scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah, first mentioned that they're not enough, and they should include things like hurriya, for freedom. And on the right hand side, you can see what classical and also contemporary scholars have said are there other, if you like, core values to be preserved. So it's a very interesting, fascinating, relatively new, only from the 11th century in Islamic terms, legal theory, and it's still growing. So let me get on to this. This is the core of this part of this presentation, which is the the two types of approaches. So we've seen there is a notion of tradition of human rights within Islam. So why are some Muslims reticent about jumping aboard the bandwagon of the modern human rights movement? The first one is about the lack of participation, and we mentioned that already. The second one is about the politicization. And this is people are really stuck on this in some ways. They feel like to be successful, any alternative human rights, you first have to dismantle the if you like hegemony, they call it, of Eurocentrism, American exceptionalism, Orientalism, and it's a very difficult obstacle for people to get over. One human rights lawyer, a non-Muslim rights lawyer, describes it as human rights imperialism. The Holy Trinity calls it liberalism, democracy, and human rights. And the reason why it's not the abuse in principle, the abuse of a principle is not an argument against it, unless the abuse is due to some inherent weakness. And the inherent weakness in this case is that those who advocate for human rights don't really believe in it, or doesn't have any solid foundation, which is why it's easy to dispose of it when it's in the national interest to do so. Which leads us to the next point, which is about the philosophical justification for human rights. And this is another issue where many people have problems, in the sense of what basis does human rights lie? For Muslims within human rights, it is easy. It is Islam, it is religion, it is the Quran and Sunnah. But the problem in some of the secular understandings of it is that it gives, the basis of it ends up giving primacy to human reason. And for the Western tradition, there is no ability to use any religious text, partly because of the history. So this is a different, I feel like a different theory of knowledge, and human rights from the Western perspective has said to be consisting of excessive individualism, whereas in Islam there's a kind of middle ground, a balance of collective obligation to the community as well as individual rights. There's a balancing of rights and responsibilities. So the philosophical objections are actually quite deep, but also one of the objections from the Islamic point of view is that some rights could be contrary to what are clear religious texts. Going against clear text is a big problem. And the last point is that human rights are becoming more bolder and more specific. If you like, the sort of devil is in the detail, and I think some people mean that literally. On the other side of the argument, the harmonistic approach, and I got this, as I said, from Professor Mashhur Badruddin, professor of law at SOAS. He says, well, not he says, but those people in this group, they say, first of all, there's a fallacy of origin. It doesn't really matter that Muslims didn't originally participate in the drafting. The debate has moved on from the original drafting. It doesn't matter where the rights came from. It could have different bases, but the same, if you like, parallel conclusion. The point is to find common ground with human rights tradition, within human rights. We have a human rights tradition in Islam, and the aim is dialogue and discussion. And secular language is used because for a reason, because it, to be inclusive, but it's not that the project itself is devoid of any kind of religious ideas. There's also flexibility in the interpretation and application of human rights law. Technically, this is called the margin of appreciation, which is something used in the European Court of Human Rights that allows states to, if you like, deviate from articles. And it's an opportunity to cooperate with other religious communities on mutual interests. I think that the biggest issue really, and the biggest argument from the harmonistic side is that is the issue of the modern state, the context of the modern state. The state is the main threat to human rights in most Muslim societies, and human rights is a moral language particularly adapted to cope with this threat. So perhaps the strongest case for human rights is this consequentialist one. Now, on the Muslim side, before we even go to the text, we need to recognize that the Islamic tradition is already rich in diversity of thought and opinion. Secondly, and so there might be flexibility to adapt to a situation from within the classical tradition. Secondly, we can go to the classical opinions and understand them in the light of their historical context. And thirdly, we can go to the texts themselves to reinterpret them to fulfill the spirit, ethic, and purpose of the law. So I'm running out of time, actually, unfortunately, but I'm going to go through some of these case studies quite quickly in part 3, unfortunately. I have mentioned some of this stuff before, and before we even talk about law, we should mention and how law can change. This is something I mentioned last week, a slide about our approach to classical works. The fact that we don't, not in the business of changing Islamic laws to please other people, but we do have an obligation to continuously reinterpret. So I've covered these slides before in the previous session. The fact that most of the laws are actually rationale based in Islam, and they require ongoing scrutiny and legal interpretation to ensure that their application remains consistent with their rationales. I've talked about the methods of adaptation of fiqh in the previous e-circle, but just want to spend a minute on this. There's a sort of misunderstanding about ijtihad, which is that it is only used when a scholar finds no explicit text in either the Quran or the Sunnah. The reality is ijtihad is something which is a basic essential measure of the Muslim community. It's something which is a continuous process, and the quotes here come from Sheikh Dr. Taha Jabir Al-Alwani, the former founder and chairman of the Fiqh Council of North America. So let me just give you one case study. I'll give you both case studies, but I'll just cover them fairly briefly. One is about traveling without a Mahrem, which affects women. There seems to be a text. There are some texts where the Prophet said a woman must not travel for 3 days except with a Mahrem. So some fatwa, some even modern day fatwa have said women cannot travel alone. But there's another hadith where a companion said the Prophet told him that there will be a time that women will travel from far distance till they make tawaf around the Kaaba, fearing no one except Allah. And so the European Council of Fatwa and Research have said this confirms that the cause, the illah, if you like, of prohibition is fear of insecurity. If security is guaranteed and fear is no more present, a woman may travel. And similarly, the Dar al-Ifta in Egypt has said a woman can travel alone as long as the trip there back is safe. So this is a situation where there was a change in the kind of conditions of society. Freedom of religion is one of the bigger topics within the human rights debate. There seems to be a conflict between Article 18 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion. This includes the freedom to change his religion or belief. Now, often people have said there's a conflict with Islamic texts. Is there a conflict in the Quran? There's no conflict in the Quran. It's a repeated affirmation of freedom of religion. Now, there are a couple of hadith, maybe 2 or 3, and their variations. One of them is whoever changes their religion kills them. Man baddala deenahu faqtuluhu. And another one, it is not legal to spill the blood except in one of 3 cases. Now, one important thing to understand is that punishments for crime is considered a matter for a political authority only. So when we look at the Quran, it's clear there is nothing in the Quran against this Article 18. But when you analyze the Hadith, there are some methods of analyzing Hadith. And in this instance, the first Hadith cannot be applied literally. It has to be understood in the light of the second Hadith. And the context of the first Hadith is that it was a group of Muslims who had rejected Islam and then began to challenge the Khalif Ali at the time. So the scholars of today have said that in actual fact, what we have is that the crime is not apostasy. The crime is actually apostasy plus a public act of rebellion and treason. So considering the evidence from the Quran, the importance of intentions, the sin of hypocrisy, the sunnah that the Prophet ﷺ never put an apostate to death, they say, therefore, there is no capital punishment for apostasy in Islam. And when you look at the juristic opinions on this issue, there is a variety. Some people have said that there's a consensus, but actually there isn't, or there wasn't a consensus necessarily. Most scholars did connect apostasy with treason in some way, but some held that apostasy was a crime, for which there was no punishment on earth. Others said that the punishment was some kind of discretion for the political authority. But we know that also that this penalty was abolished, officially, if you like, formally, by the Sheikh al-Islam at the time in the Ottoman Empire, and then again it was repeated by Al-Azhar. Anyway, so my last 10 minutes, I'm just going to briefly cover a review and a kind of recap of what we've covered so far. So we've covered the history of human rights, the abuses and uses of human rights, core values, Muslim responses to the human rights, philosophical objections, areas of tension between human rights laws and pre-modern interpretations of Islamic law. So in my last few minutes, we've looked at the variety of views within Muslims over human rights, but there's another side to the story. Human rights is not conceived in the same way by human rights academics and practitioners. And in this slide, I'm introducing you to something which is Professor Marie Benedict Dembo, Professor of Law Anthropology at University of Sussex now, where she says actually there are 4 schools of thought on human rights, where she describes there are natural scholars. And this is the kind of orthodox view. And many people have been looking at human rights from only the orthodox window. But there are other ways of looking at human rights. The orthodox view is mostly mentioned, or human rights are universal, and law is what is the way that human rights is actually enacted. But there are another group of scholars, and they're not clear-cut schools necessarily, but which she calls the deliberative school. Human rights are actually something which are agreed upon, and the orthodoxy is moving towards this school. And so human rights come into existence because of the way that they are agreed upon between people. And there are other schools where the protest school, human rights, they're not interested in laws as much. Their chief interest is about redressing injustice. And there's another school, which is the sort of discourse school, which is kind of not anti-human rights, but they actually they talk about the sort of failures of the human rights system quite a lot. I won't go into the details of what each group talks about. And I'll leave this slide up if you wanted to pause the video and read some of what's been said. The point of what I'm trying to say about this and introducing this is that human rights is a diverse field. It's not just about law. For many, law is a distraction. The issue is one of injustice and oppression, and there's no one single way of actually thinking about humans. There are some views that are actually heavily, self-critical. So I think we need to engage in this field properly, fully, and also constructively. It's in our interests, and it's in everybody's interests. So this is what I would say. I mentioned that there were 2 views before, the harmonistic and adversarial, and I'm going to take a kind of middle position. This is, if you like, my sort of synthesis of both approaches. There's a kind of total acceptance, which is part of the harmonistic view, and there's also mostly rejection, which is the opposite view. I don't think there is a 4th option. You might think, is there a total rejection, as some people have said, because the notions of human rights in Islam are actually historically quite strong. But I would say that the middle position is the one that we need to engage with more, and the reasons are actually many. We are commanded to cooperate with one another in goodness and righteousness in the Quran. The famous Hilf al-Fudul, the pact that the Prophet ﷺ had joined before prophethood, a pact which was dedicated to redressing the wrongs done to individuals in Mecca. After receiving the message, the Prophet said, after receiving prophethood, the Prophet ﷺ said about this, if they were to call to me to respond to it today, I would respond to it. It is a collective obligation upon us to command what is good, prevent what is harmful to the extent that we are able. I think, you know, many, if not most, of the human rights called for by the Modern Human Rights Project are a part of Islam. Another big reason is that there is a gulf between the theory and the practice of human rights in many Muslim societies today. So we should focus on some essential, agreed upon, harmful practices, usually that arise out of culture and ignorance and not the religion. It is a duty upon us to support those oppressed in the name of justice, wherever they are. And we need to contribute to the debate, dialogue, education, awareness with human rights activists, academics, and lawyers. So that is the position that I'm going to advocate, a kind of middle position as well. Go back to this slide, principles of literacy, in my last couple of minutes. If we have any questions, I think what we'll do is we'll just, if we haven't got time for them, if you leave them up in the Q&A, I might put the answers into the slides. So when you get the slides, you might see the answers in the slides. So I mentioned I was going to look at this a little bit. We have covered this applied to the just war theory, the different levels of jihad. But we could apply this concept of literacy to Islam and human rights. We've seen that there's a diversity of views on the modern human rights debate within Islam. We've seen how change occurs within Islamic thought. You know, revisiting classical juristic opinions by analyzing the illah and the hikmah. Some people make a distinction between the illah and the hikmah. Sometimes it's not quite as clear cut, as in the example I mentioned about traveling without Mahrem. We've talked about the reinterpretation of texts towards the ethic and the spirit and the purpose of the law. And we've talked about the fact that ijtihad is a continuous process, or ijtihad of the context is a continuous process required upon all of us. And the fact that culture is embedded within religion, we need to consider always the original context of revelation of a text. And we need to consider the historical context of the interpretation of a text. How did the jurists interpret some texts? And I think one of the biggest issues on this human rights debate is the nature of the modern state itself. And that's, for me, is one of the biggest reasons why we need to engage more in the human rights debate. Just wanted to say briefly something about the diversity within Islam. It is one of the strengths of Islam. There is this diversity. It's not a wild diversity that includes everybody and anything. Okay, I'm going to finish now. There's less diversity within theology, but a wider diversity within schools of law. And I think all of the tendencies, it's not just the madhabs, but also all the tendencies, traditionalism, Salafism, Islamism, modernism, all have something to bring to the table. They all have something to enlighten us with. And that's why I think the importance of akhlaq and adab is central when you study these sort of areas, because we are trying to, if you like, learn from different people. Just briefly, my last slide is on the characteristics of Islam. Godliness is our foundation. This is also this is haqq Allah. Humanity focused, because the whole of Shariah is revealed for the benefit and betterment of humankind. Okay, this is the point of the Shariah. Islam is comprehensive for all times, all places, at all levels, mind, body, and soul. And openness. Islam, we say, it liberates the mind, it urges contemplation of the universe, it honors knowledge and scholarship, science and scientists, it welcomes all that is good and beneficial to mankind. And this famous hadith, wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he's more deserving of it. And my last slide is about balance. Balance between individualism and collectivism, the balance between unity and diversity, the balance between reason and revelation, which we mentioned, and also balance within revelation. We have a balanced approach to hadith. We don't ditch all hadith, but we don't accept everything, if you like, everything uncritically. There's a balanced approach to Quran. Neither, what we mentioned last time, excessive naskh, excessive abrogation, or someone called it reverse naskh. Don't do any of that. It's a holistic approach. A stability and flexibility, and balance between existing tradition and ijtihad. Everyone's opinion, and this is my last line, everyone's opinion, except that of the Prophet ﷺ, is liable to change and modification. We accept all that has reached us from the past, and we don't score and attack these people, individuals who differed with us, because we don't know what their intentions were. So we should not refrain from, conceptually challenge some of the understanding of human rights, but not to undermine it, but to enhance our universal collective quest for a more just and humane world. So that was my point about this talk. Jazakallah khair for listening. I'm sorry it's taken a little bit longer than I planned. I hope this has been of some benefit to someone. All the good is from Allah, and all the mistakes are mine. وما توفيقي إلا بالله وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Huge thank you to our speaker, Mubashir Khan, for another very, very interesting talk. So we look forward to seeing you at some future ISB campus and e-circles, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.